Well, good morning or afternoon to you all. Glad to see you. We've got a very intimate group today. So if at any time you have any questions, just let us know. You are free to put them in the chat. If you wouldn't mind saying hello in the chat and where you're connecting from, we always appreciate that. That makes us feel good. Today we are going over growth reports. We're very lucky that we have your product manager for ParentGauge, Sandy, who's going to be giving the demo and answering any questions. I'm going to go ahead and transfer it on over to Sandy and let her get started. So good to see y'all.
Thanks, Lucretia, and welcome everybody. So last week we went over the baseline report, and that's a great report, especially if you're newer to ParentGauge, haven't had as many interview seasons, because you're able to jump in and you can use a baseline report with any number of interviews that you've done already. And with just one interview season, you're going to have a good baseline report. The growth report really builds on that. The growth report is meant to look at 2 periods of time, whereas the baseline report is looking at 1. So that's what we're going to go over today is that growth report. And this is a report that if you're newer to ParentGauge, you'll probably want to wait until you've gone through 2 interview seasons to really make use of it. And before then, the baseline report is going to be your best friend before that point. Okay, so to navigate to the growth report, it's going to be the same as our baseline report. We have 2 ways of getting there within ParentGauge, and that's going to be either through the top menu where it'll show both, or when you're at the main homepage here, it'll have this evaluate progress button, and you can go to the growth report from there as well. And a lot of this is going to look very familiar to what we went over last week. So the filters are going to play a big function here, even more so than the baseline report, because, if we don't acknowledge what interview periods we're looking at, everything's going to be zeroed out pretty much. So these filters are going to come into play even more so than they did in the baseline report. And a lot of them are going to be similar, right? We can filter by the program type, child service type, by native language, disability. You can break it out between Head Start and Early Head Start, all of that fun stuff. And if you're less interested with the broader admin data and you're looking more at your own classroom, you can even go and filter just by the teacher of that classroom, and you can look at just specific classrooms there. So that's going to be the same here. The biggest difference is going to be that we're going to distinguish between which periods we're comparing with the growth report. Because like its namesake, the growth report is really looking at the difference between one interview season to another. So we're going to tell the system, we want to look at my mid-year interview. Like, let's say I just finished my mid-year interview season for this school year, and I want to compare it to last year. So I'm going to choose my first interview period as 21-22 mid-year, and my second as 22-23 mid-year. We're going to filter there. And then here, this is going to be similar to the baseline report. We're going to be able to see what data we're pulling in. So I have my test program here. I'm pulling in all of the centers that are assigned to that test since I didn't filter out any of them. And I can do a quick gut check here as well and see that in my first round of interviews, I did 18 interviews. In my second round, I did 24. And so that just gives you a quick gut check of, am I filtering to all of the right centers that I wanted to? If I was getting to just one specific center, maybe these would be high or vice versa. But that gives you a quick gut check, and also some statistics there on what we're looking at, right? Because here, since my interviews are kind of lower, right? I have 18 and 24 for this full program. So about a third less interviews were conducted in that first season. So that does give me a little bit of something to think about when I'm looking at my results as well, right? Because I have not the exact same amount of families that were interviewed. There could be some differences in what families are missing in the second round, or it could be accurate, right? Maybe we just had some growth in this particular center and that is accurate, but that just gives you some information on what you're comparing as well, because it's not going to be exact. And in fact, I've heard some programs that when we're looking at things like a mid-year compared to a post, they're only interviewing the same families that were present for a mid-year and not including their newer families, because they want to look at the same families' results over time. So something to think about, and that gives you a glimpse into the differences that we're going to see there. Then the legend is going to give you some more information on, just analyzing this report. In this case, the growth report, you are going to see some green and red arrows when we keep scrolling down. And that's just letting us know there's been a significant change here between one interview season to another. And it'll be green or red depending on if that was a positive or a negative change there. You'll also see that certain questions they have a border around them because they really, it's like one question, but there's two parts to it. So you'll see in some cases, right, we're asking the parent, do you have this habit? And then does the program promote that habit? And so those are going to be paired together. And so you'll see that through this report, similar to the baseline report there. And again, we have our report scale. So as you're interviewing families, where they're responding, but with not at all to very much. And we're just assigning a value to it so that we can create averages based on those responses. And that's where the similarities between the baseline and the growth are primarily going to stop. As we start going through, you'll see that there's going to be more results here than your baseline report. Our growth report, again, is comparing two different seasons. So our broader scales here, this is our overall averages from the parent specific questions. When we were looking at the year last school year mid-year scale, our parent scale was at 3.5. If we compare that to this year's mid-year scale, we're at 3.7. So we had a little bit of growth there. And then if we look at those program specific questions, we can see that last year we were at a 4.0, this year we're at 3.9. So barely a drop, probably not too worried about that. But overall, that's going to give us a good idea of how these two seasons compare. Now, if we wanted to get more granular, we can go into each question and we're going to be able to see exactly where those differences are coming from. And this is where you'll start seeing those arrows come into play as well. So in this case, this is all question one, broken out, right? In this case, we do have our sub questions all listed here as well. And we can see in some cases for 21 through 22, maybe we didn't have to ask these questions because they weren't specific to the families that were enrolled. So we don't have responses there, and that's totally fine, right? As we're comparing, we know it's comparing it to nothing. It could have also been a family that refused to answer those questions or something along those lines. But essentially, we don't have data there, and that's totally fine. It's going to give you the results that we do have from the families this year. And if there were any changes, that's going to show here as well. As we can see with question one, though, when I started with the program, the staff tried to learn about my family's interests and concerns. Last year, we had it at a 4.0. So most of our families were rating us as mostly, right? And so this year we actually went up. So we had more that were rating us as a very much and got that score a little bit higher. That does count as a significant change, that 0.45 difference. And so we're seeing this green arrow letting us know there was some improvement between these two periods, which is awesome. As you go through, you'll see like these ones, like I said, these are showing none, so it's not going to compare those. And then we'll get further into other questions and you'll see, again, those green arrows come up. Sometimes you won't see an arrow, and that's just because it's saying this 0.8 of a change wasn't a significant change. So it's not calling it out to you, but this is really meant to draw the eye to where are we seeing improvements and where are we seeing scores go down enough that maybe we want to take a second look there. So in this case, right, our second questions here, we had a lot of growth throughout most of this particular season, right? And when we looked at those broader scales, they were pretty similar, couple points up. So this is where that's coming from. And we can see, you know, we have a significant increase in parents who are saying they do have daily routines with their children. They are, the program is helping with those daily routines. Maybe we made that a goal after we saw these scores last year, and we do see that they went up this year. And the same with the goals for child's development and learning, right? Last year we were getting, right in the middle, a 3. This year we're getting a 4. So there was either our families are showing up and they are already coming in with more goals, or maybe we made some differences in the program that have helped them identify those goals and development, the child development goals and learning goals. And then here in number 5, we can see this is one where we are seeing a decrease. So, and this was the question, I know how to help my child meet and play with other children. Especially if we're looking at like these weird COVID years, this might be some interesting data to see, right? Because if this was my early Head Start children, maybe I'm starting to see those kids who have been growing up in just a COVID environment starting to come through and not have those same those same areas of that children, naturally have when it comes to meeting and playing with other children. Maybe they've missed out on some of those opportunities, and I'm going to start seeing that come through my program in this year, right? So that's something to think about, and that might help us determine, like, yeah, we want to make sure we're adding in more opportunities for our children to meet and play with other children, right? So these are the types of things that, even if there hasn't been any differences, like let's say this was an initial interview season, that might be something to look at and to start making some changes in, at least having that red flag there, letting us know this particular program is we went down a full point here. That's pretty significant. This might be something to take a deeper look at. And if I wanted to get real specific, similar to the baseline report, I can click on that question and I can target those families who responded with lower scores directly, right? So in this case, it's a pretty small subset. This is 13 responses here. And so it's really just these 3 families. Maybe I need to touch base with them. Maybe they have something in common that I want to make sure that I'm making sure that they have these opportunities to play with other children. Now, one thing you'll notice here, as I drilled down into this particular question, is that this mean response is different from what I saw earlier, and so are the total responses. And that's actually because when you drill down, it's only pulling in one interview season, right? So that is something to keep in mind. If you were doing data validation, then I would suggest doing that through your baseline report, where you're looking at one period of time to begin with. And the growth report is more for looking at those broader goals, right? So we're doing less data validation here. You could come in and update the filter here so that we are looking at a separate interview season, and you could validate them both that way. But it's probably easier to do that validation beforehand and then come into the growth report. So keep that in mind. If we wanted to just target who in that first year that I was looking at was responding lower, you could update this so that you're looking at that particular period, but it is going to default to bringing up the most recent. So just something to keep in mind there. And again, similar to the baseline report, this drill down is actually the same as the baseline report. If these 2 particular responders refused, that's fine. I want to focus in on my not very much over here. And if I click on that number, it's actually going to give me the name of the child and guardian. So I can get deeper into what we need to do for this family specifically to them. Okay, jumping back out to my growth report here. Again, this is pretty straightforward, I think, in most cases, right? Like I said, the green and red arrows are going to give you some things to call out to. And this could also be a way of a report that would be useful when you are looking at or having conversations around grant requests, or with your lawmakers and all the people that you have to report to. This could be an interesting report to show the impact that your program's having on certain families, or overall, because you are able to get really specific with these filters. So you could look at, when we compare our initial interviews from the beginning of the year to by the end of the year, we can see how much growth that we've had within a season. Within one school year. And that can be really helpful when you're, identifying what how the program is impacting your families. One thing that I do want to point out, if you are filtering to an initial interview season, is the initial interview seasons, they are a little different as far as the interview questions. They're not going to include program specific questions because it is specific to just the beginning of the year where there hasn't necessarily been an impact from the program yet. So these initial questions they're going to show up here, but it's not going to show the program specific questions. So keeping that in mind, if you're looking at one school year and you're including an initial interview season, that is something to keep in mind. You're not going to have those program questions. So that scale is going to be missing on this side. And then you're not going to see the comparison since those initial interviews do not include the program specific questions. So outside of that, similar to our baseline report again, if we wanted to print out this pretty version of the report, you can do that by clicking on print here, and it's going to look just like it does on your screen. You're going to be able to see those same arrows, same comparison, all of that fun stuff, and you can forward this on to whoever you need to see these results. If we wanted to get at the raw data, you can also use that download button, and it's going to be the same results as our baseline reports. But the difference here is that it is going to show all of my evaluation period. So when we looked at our baseline raw data set, it's just looking at that one particular period. This time it's going to give you all of the interview details for all of the interviews that were included. So a little different from the report we were just looking at. Instead of looking at the results and here are the areas where we improved, here are the areas where our score went down. Now we're looking at here's all the raw data, and we can see exactly which families were part of that mid-year assessment, which ones were part of the initial assessment in this case, and all of the data associated with them. So a little bit different from the printable report. Instead of giving you the results, this is going to be all of the raw data. And again, the questions here, they're going to be summarized, right? They just have these codes here, and you can use this labels tab to get deeper into those questions so that you can get specific with exactly which question was asked where. And it's also going to give you all of your qualitative data in these raw data sets as well. So if we wanted to pull out like, okay, here's all of this school year's quotes from these questions, you'll be able to pull them all up here. Okay, and I know I'm talking real fast here, so I'm going to pause for any questions that we might have right now. And Lucretia, any questions from the chat that I missed? I was not keeping an eye on that side.
I know I've got it. I'm so sorry. I was talking muted. I did it again. So we have a couple of people who have asked the same style question. If you have a child who came on board after the mid-year assessments were done, do you still include them as a post, or do you do them as a mid-year since that's the first one that they did that year? How would they work that?
That's a great question, because and Lucretia, by all means, chime in, because I know there are different programs that use it differently. And I think the best thing to do is be consistent, right? So you're going to determine what makes the most sense, and then you're going to be consistent with it. And I think in most cases, it probably makes sense for when that family joins, maybe we do an initial interview to get an idea of where they're at and identify any specific goals that we want to work on with that family. But if they've already missed the mid-year season of our interview period, then would probably leave them out in most cases and then wait for that post-interview season to come around. Now that can be different in this scenario, right? I'm talking about where we are doing all 3 interview seasons. Some programs only do a mid-year assessment or are only doing mid and post, which is totally fine. And if you're doing that, that'll probably change your mind on how you want to include that family. So if we're only doing mid-years and this family joins later, you know, probably I would still include that family. But Lucretia, what do you think?
I agree with you. The one thing I do want to point out is that if you set it up as a mid-year, that information is not going to pull into the post data. So if you do a baseline report on your post and you've done that child as a mid-year, it's not going to show. So if your question is specific to where do we want that data to be put? Do we want it put with the ones that have already been done, or do we want it put with the ones that are coming up? If it's the ones that are coming up, go ahead. Don't worry about whether they were there for the mid-year and do it in the post. Knowing where your data is going to go is going to be key as to how you do it. If this did not specifically answer your questions, please let us know if there's a better way for us to answer it. Unmute and ask away.
Yeah, and I also to add into that too, I know one program that we talked to recently, they mentioned that they won't even do, I don't think they're doing an initial interview, but they won't do a mid-year until that family's been in the program for a couple months. So that way they can answer those program specific questions more specifically. So just to add another dynamic onto things, you know, by all means, this is your data, this is your reporting. And I think one way to decide for your particular program is to think about what do we want these reports to show us? What do we want them to tell us? And in that case, you know, you can kind of decide, does it make sense for me to include this family now in mid-year or wait for the next interview season?
Okay, so this is Sue Coco. I'm one that had one of those questions that you answered. And just to clarify, so our program is choosing just to do mid and post. So we did our mids had to be done, like say the month of December. We did mid for all the families that were enrolled at that time. And then now we're working on our post. And so families who came in brand new between the mid and the post, I've been told they will get a post this year.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in my mind, I'm just trying to process because now I'm a brand new family and I'm asking post questions about how did this program help you? And they're like, well, I just got here, so I'm not sure yet, you know? And maybe those questions they don't answer very well because of that. I just, in my mind, they would get an initial, but we're not doing initial. So then they would get a mid, but yeah, it might mess us up for reporting. So is it okay to have a brand new family do a post?
Yeah, I would say that it is okay for them to do a post. And then once you are reviewing your data, that would be something to keep an eye out for. You know, if we're seeing there are a couple scores that were lower or, you know, that are lower than what the average is, then you might see those same families pop up in that scenario, right? That were the reason, and you'd be able to identify that. Or like I mentioned, there are some programs where they decide, you haven't spent enough time with us to answer these questions meaningfully, and they just don't ask those questions, and that's okay to do too.
If I could also point out, the difference between the mid and the post is simply where the data falls. The questions are actually identical. So regardless of which template you're using, the questions are going to be the same, but how you set it up in the system, if you say that the interview is mid or is it post, that's where it's going to be different, because that's where it's going to decide the information goes. So if they've already missed the mid and they're telling you to do the post, just know that the questions are still the same between the two.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Lucretia, because I think one thing that we hear sometimes is we have, you know, the same questions. And I think when you look at the growth report, you can really understand why they are the same questions, right? We want to compare apples to apples. We want to see, how did you answer this in the middle of the year versus how you did at the end?
Right.
Because we're making program changes in the middle of that, and we are, you know, having different goals throughout the year. So, you know, that is something that sometimes we hear is like, okay, if these questions are the same, what's the point? But there is a point, and part of it is so that we can see how effective we're being with these PFCE goals that we have.
Does that help at all, Sue?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
I feel like I get confused because we're trying to, early Head Start is home-based for us, and we have Head Start center-based. and I know Head Start wants to use our data with theirs. So we have reporting times and we can look at the data. I just feel like our families kind of come and go more so than in Head Start. And so for me, like, we're not doing initials, but I question that. I'm like, I want to do initials because it would help with goal setting, I think, and getting to know the family a little bit better. But we started with mid, which is okay. I'm just trying to get it as set in my mind with early Head Start, I guess.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get it. And if you do the post, it's going to be the same questions as the mid, but it will give you the data in the right time frame.
Perfect. And that's probably what Head Start wants. I'm good with that.
Okay. Are there any other questions we can help anyone? Oh, here we go. Would it be beneficial to do the initial, then the post, or stick to what we currently are doing mid-year and post?
Great question. Yeah. And I mean, there are benefits to doing that initial interview. You know, like we said earlier, it's just the questions around the family. And so really, I think what's going to make the biggest difference on whether you're going to be able to do an initial or not is timing, right? That's the hardest part, is usually the time commitment. But there are some benefits to doing the initial, just because you're able to, from the beginning of the year, let's find out what our families are currently working on, what do they already have, handled. And if you're able to use that to inform some program decisions, then an initial can be really beneficial.
Right. I agree. That's excellent. But if you have to choose between an initial or a mid, the initial isn't going to give you the full questions. It's only going to give for the family, not for how the program is doing. So when you do your growth reports, you're going to be missing out on that portion. Yeah. So if you have to choose between initial and mid, we recommend the mid. If you can do all three, that's wonderful. And I know that Sandy had already probably said this, but there are some programs who do an initial just as a new family starts, just to kind of get a grasp of what they're doing, not for the data itself in a report, but so that they can get a feel for the family and where the family is at the time that they start.
Awesome. Great questions. I know we only have 2 minutes left here. So if there's any quick questions, we have a little bit of time there. Otherwise, I also wanted to point out something I think me and Lucretia were talking about beforehand, that we wanted to make sure everyone was aware that the reports are going to automatically grab any interviews, even if they're incomplete. So if you have one that a family started but wasn't able to get to the very end of, so it was kind of left in limbo, that does naturally go back into the reports. So if you wanted to exclude it completely, you would have to either delete it or filter so that you're not including those reports. And so just something to keep in mind. The filtering function, it will automatically bring in any incomplete interviews, inactive members on those interviews. Those will still come through. So it's going to grab everything that it can, basically, by nature, unless you purposely filter it out. Okay, and with that, that's our last of our Lunch and Learn sessions for now. Keep an eye out for any future webinars we have. And if you do have any more questions, or you want to talk more about what reports make the most sense for your program specifically, reach out to us. Both Lucretia and I can help you with that. You can open a ticket through the system or email us directly.
Thank you so much, everyone. Great job, Sandy. Good job.